Hey, big fucking dreamer. So pumped to be here with you today. And we've got a special guest friend of the pod, Victoria Maurer. She is a former PwC accountant turned life coach turned master breathwork instructor. There is nothing this chick can't do. So I'm so happy to be here. She's one of my close friends. We transitioned into the coaching world from corporate in a similar time frame, and we were just having an interesting conversation, which is why I wanted to have her on the podcast. So, Victoria, welcome. I'm so happy to have you here.
Amazing. Thanks, Hannah. So excited to be here. I feel like we need to bring the podcast to our fishbowl dates and just start recording our conversations. So many good nuggets of wisdom in those chats.
You should just put the microphone on because we just get fishbowl with the American life coaches. Was it at Fishbowl? The reason for this podcast, it was during some sort of conversation that we were having. I don't remember if it was at Fishbowl or if it was over a voice note, but after I got engaged, I went through, I don't know if it was an existential crisis, but I definitely went through some sort of, this has nothing to do with my partner. I really believe that this would have happened to me with anyone that I was with. And I think, Chris is like really amazing and really, I just couldn't think of someone better for me. But I kind of had this moment following actually a workshop with Elizabeth Gilbert. I was just really triggered. And I think that the main reason was because like I didn't ever really think I would get here. Like I didn't think I would ever be engaged, let alone like be engaged to a really kind, wonderful, like interesting man who wanted to be with me. And I've had a lot of trauma in my past that has kind of led to this. And I was telling you about this and how I had worked through it in therapy. And you were like, oh, that's really interesting. Like, that's just all self-sabotage in the nervous system. I've done a lot of EMDR, but it's not necessarily something that I've touched on a lot. I'm medically going to start working with a somatic practitioner because I feel like that's kind of the next stage. But I was just like, what are you talking about? So I'm going to like throw it over to you to just talk about how you think self-sabotage shows up in the nervous system. We could draw on like that specific scenario or any other scenarios that you see.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I think, especially with high performers, like, we do all this mindset work and we talk about how we're going to make changes and, like big fucking dreams and all this amazing stuff. But then we forget about the nervous system. And when the nervous system sabotages, the difference is it doesn't really show you that it is sabotaging. So you might go back and do old patterns or, things that you used to do in the past. And you can easily say to yourself, okay, I'm sabotaging this. What's happening here? But when it's like just a feeling and it kind of shows up how I've noticed in myself, and maybe you can relate to this as well. And in other clients I work with, high performers, and it's nice to have these chats with you because you work with high performers as well. And I think it's like, it's a different caliber of person that we're working with. So it shows up as kind of fear versus intuition. So when the nervous system sabotage comes in, it feels like in your body, you can feel it in your body, whether it's a nervous pit or it's like something that drives you to change the way that you're acting. And a lot of times that shows up as, well, is this fear or is this intuition? And then it's like, okay, this is actually my nervous system speaking to me. So how can I regulate my nervous system? And that's where, in the work that I do, we use breath work, kind of use it as like a lever to upregulate or downregulate the nervous system depending on where you're at. And in most cases with high performers, it's a need to downregulate, make sure the body knows that it feels safe. And that's what's slower than normal breathing. And somatics is an amazing practice to put into that too, kind of releasing things from the body. And that book, The Body Keeps the Score, like such an amazing book. So much truth in there. That's how I would classify nervous system sabotage. It comes up as like a very subtle, slight thing. It's not super obvious. And if you have something in your life where, like, you'll use your example for your engagement, for example, and I'm actually facing into something similar myself. I'm about to go traveling for a year with a partner who I love very much. I'm very excited. And my nervous system's like, and I can recognize like, this is my nervous system. So what do I need to do about it? But if you have everything kind of working out the way you've always wanted and things are good, your nervous system is acting up. Why is that? Because it's not used to being in that kind of safe space. As you mentioned in your past, you have lots of different traumatic relationships and all things that were happening. It's like your body's like, we can't actually believe that we're here. So how are we going to wreck this to bring this back to what we're used to feeling?
Yeah, well, I'm really interested in the fear versus intuition. I'm always quite skeptical as intuition as a construct and even as a concept because there's something called the ACE test, so the Adverse Childhood Experience Test. So the ACE test is a real indicator of if you went through abuse, divorce, were exposed to alcoholism, drug addiction. There's a series of questions and then you get a score at the end. So if you scored high on the ACE test, you're more likely to be prone to addiction. You're more likely to be prone to many types of things. But whenever anyone talks about intuition, I almost like inherently have an issue with it. If you look at a certain subset of people which are traumatized, and I often think like the correlation between high performance and trauma for me is very strong. I don't treat trauma at all as a coach. That's definitely more for therapy, but the correlation is strong. Your intuition will likely be what you're used to and what you have experienced. And if that is a trauma filled past, then it will likely be like pointing you more toward that. And you will kind of confuse intuition with repeating behavior.
That's why it's so hard to differentiate between is this intuition or fear, and you need to create that stillness to actually understand the difference. And I guess with what you're saying with the ACE test and traumas, there probably is something else there to consider. But normally I see that intuition is quite quiet. It's just like a subtle voice that's like, do this or think about this or what about that? Whereas fear is more like manic or we need to move quick and it's like kind of rushed or hurried or almost more like anxious or jumpy. But so I think that that's something definitely to consider. But also, intuition can get like just completely buried by, I know you do a lot of parts work in your work with clients as well. IFS is a huge part of my work and the work that I do on myself and I do with clients and from a coach capacity anyway. Healing those like protector parts, which are the, I guess, traumatized or wounded parts, then allows more space for that, we call self or true self to speak. And then that for me is intuition. And how can you actually feel that in your body? It's like a lightness and an ease or like a shackles on, shackles off kind of exercise that you can go through to differentiate between fear and intuition.
You could have a part that is, let's say, more anxious or more avoidant, and that part has its own history. This is what my intuition, but then that part is actually like a high self-sabotage part. Am I in a part right now? Am I triggered? Am I activated? Or am I calm? And
Yeah.
am I coming from, in IFS, we call it like self-energy.
Exactly. And I think that that's the key. And that's the hard thing to do when you're in it is actually realize that you're in it. And realize that you have a part that's running the show and not just you, especially as a high performer. Oftentimes our high performing parts are, running for something that, and we think that that's just how it goes. And it's really hard to kind of pull out of that pattern. So if you can notice yourself feeling in your body anxious or uneasy about something that you've always wanted or always dreamed of, me traveling the world for a year, for example, with someone who I love very much, you getting married, for example, for someone who you love very much, and then it's something like swooping in, trying to like fuck it all up, then it's like, well, this is probably nervous system sabotage. How can I actually look at this problem from that angle and try and solve it from that angle rather than talk myself out of something or talk myself into something? How can I just get into my body, find where that wound is, whether it's through somatic work or it's through breath work or it's through some other type of practice that people enjoy. Maybe just noticing there's another avenue to these feelings that you're having is like, oh, maybe this is nervous system sabotage. Maybe I should look into how I can actually help my nervous system in this scenario rather than just attack it how I normally would with other things that are coming up in my life.
It's interesting because I'm also guilty of this, of like, okay, just wanting to do more therapy around something or more, like tackle those limiting beliefs. And it's almost just like put more on that versus going the nervous system route. What do you see as signs of nervous system self-sabotage or just self-sabotage in general? Like what are the signs that you usually see?
Well, I would say it's anxiousness around things that should be bringing you joy and excitement. That's a big one. Those are the examples that we've just given. Lack of sleep, inability to have sleep through the night, clenching of the jaw, loss of hair. So I'll use another example. When I was moving out to Australia, I was so excited. I wasn't really anxious or nervous or anything, or I didn't think I was, but my eye was twitching. I had like acne, a hormonal acne breakout. My hair was falling out. So that is nervous system sabotage. My nervous system was not at ease, even though my mind was, I remember my mom being like, is everything okay? Are you sure you're not worried about this move? And I was like, no, I'm not. I'm fine. My eyes twitching and my hair is falling out. And she's like, I think you're worried. And it's like my body, my nervous system was worried, but my mind wasn't. So that's also something to consider is sometimes we think I've always wanted this wedding or I've always wanted this thing, but you have to bring your body on board. And something, now maybe bringing too many topics in. So tell me about like Gay Hendricks talks about the upper limit problem. And it's like when you reach that next, that upper limit of something that you've always wanted and dreamed of, and you become that person, and your body is like, whoa, we're not used to playing here. We're not good enough to be here. This can't be real for us. And then it starts showing up as all these nervous system sabotage things. So those are kind of the most common things. So one is feeling anxious in a situation that you've always dreamed about and really wanted. Two is some things are going on in your body that haven't been there before. So hair loss, clenching jaw, just struggle sleeping, changes in your energy, things like that. But it's usually quite subtle.
Yeah, it's sometimes your body hasn't caught up to the reality of what your life is now. Like this is really common in addicts and sobriety and alcoholics and sobriety who get sober and they're like, even myself, like I'm like a highly functional person, and sometimes people will say things about me and I'm like, who, me? I'm like an alcoholic. It's like I've been drinking years. I haven't done drugs in years. Like I'm like coming up to 8 years sober in a few weeks. Like my whole like I am like a very respectable like my communication with my partner is like so down pat. Like I teach these methods, I run a successful business, but like in my mind, I'm like, I'm just like a fucking degenerate. It took me about 5 or 6 years in sobriety for what I felt like almost like myself to catch up to what I actually was in the world and who I actually was in the world. I think as well, like pouring that with PTSD, like that has kind of been a real, like in PTSD, there's just like nervous system dysregulation inherently. That's kind of what it is. Could you talk a little bit more about the upper limit? What was the theory called?
So it's basically the idea is that you strive so much to get to something in your life. And then when you get there, you have all those exact thoughts like, I don't deserve to be here. I'm not good enough to be here. And then you have part, peaking up. And this is not Gay's language. This is my language, kind of mixing the two things together, IFF and the work that Gay does with the big leap and the upper limit problem, all of that. It's amazing. Parts that come in and are like, I'm scared. I don't want to be here. And they find a way to knock things back to where they're comfortable to play. And an example that he uses, which is quite a good one, is like Bill Clinton, obviously very successful politician, but still had a lot of trauma and wounding from when he was a boy in Arkansas. So then when he got to his upper limit, he was kind of causing all this chaos in his own life. And he's someone who had worked with Gay and they had lots of really good examples to share. But it's like exactly that. It's you're not prepping your nervous system the whole time while you're rising up so that when you get there, it's like, oh, I don't deserve to be here. I can't hold this space. I never thought it would happen. And now it's happened. And kind of a freak out moment. And you have all your parts super active. And the best way that I've seen to kind of down regulate all of these things is with breath work and just to bring it along the journey. So that's why the work that I do with clients is all the mindset stuff, but then the breath work weaved in throughout. So it's like, how can we keep your nervous system regulated to keep you calm so you don't have these big spikes or these big spirals that are like, I can't handle being here. What's happening? This is crazy. Riding the wave becomes a lot smoother.
What breathwork techniques would you actually give to clients, or are there certain patterns that you would breathing patterns that you would recommend for this?
Yeah. So it's a really good question. So it comes at it from two angles. So first thing I'll say is if you are someone who's new to breathwork and trying to experience breathwork, absolutely go see a practitioner, either that's for a class or some kind of workshop, or get in touch with me or someone else who you trust in your community. Because there is a lot of stuff about breathwork out there that people can just start dabbling with breathwork and not really know what they're doing. And if your nervous system is needing one type of breath work, but you've decided to give it another type of breath work, that's not the best. That's not the best case scenario. So what I will share is, as when you're working with high performers, oftentimes I see two different things. So sometimes we see high performers who have conflicting parts. One part that wants to run 1,000,000 miles a minute, and one part that wants to do absolutely nothing. So the one part that wants to run 1,000,000 miles a minute is the part that wants to make sure they strive to be the best version of themselves that they can be. The other part that wants to make sure they do nothing actually also wants them to be the best version of themselves that they can be, but they don't want them to get burnt out. So these two parts are quite conflicting. So if you are more sitting in one side of, and we flip flop as high performers. I see them flip flop all the time. It becomes exhausting until they do parts integration to bring them together, realize they're on the same page. So if you're kind of in that slower doing nothing phase of your kind of high performance lifestyle, then you would want to bring in some faster than normal breathing to kind of rev things up a little bit, get things moving. But if you are on the other side and you are running a million miles a minute, you can see the truck lights of burnout coming towards you. You do not want to be doing faster than normal breathing because that's sympathetic activating breath work. You want to be doing down regulating breath work, which is slower than normal breathing. So things like extended exhales, things like box breathing, things like heart coherence breathing are all slower than normal breathing. And then faster than normal breathing, you have more shamanic style or Wim Hof style breathing that you would do on that end of the spectrum. So it's really just first working with a practitioner who knows what they're doing is probably the best bet. But if you're not going to work with a practitioner, actually just knowing where you're at, kind of what does my body feel like it needs? Do I feel like I'm like jittery and running on caffeine? If that's the case, slower than normal breath work is for you. If you're someone who's a bit lethargic and you're struggling to get going and you've got a million things to do, but you can't seem to get yourself energized, then faster than normal breathing might be something you want to explore.
Like, because what you're talking about is also like parts polarization in IFS. We do this. This is a big foundation for my level 2 in the life and work transformation. We look at it through the lens of parts polarization. So I've got like a little dictator who is just like, go, 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 like always pushing me forward. And then I have like the sloth monster who's just like, get down, like be on the couch, don't move, just like rot there for days and read fantasy books. But let's say they're both equally dominant in your life during different parts. What would you then recommend?
Well, you can actually do a practice. I mean, I wouldn't recommend anything for someone to do on their own. I guess that's kind of what we're asking for. A practice to bring them together with like a balanced style of breath work, which is making sure your nervous system is calm, which is the breath work that I always do with people. Making sure your nervous system is calm, then taking them into a fast and normal breathe, and then back out into an integration where you then can start to do that parts integration because and you see probably in your clients too. And I love that's a focus of your level 2 is, oh my gosh, I need to be the sloth monster. Oh my gosh, I need to follow the dictator. And it's just like whiplash going back and forth side to side. So actually for that, I would recommend doing some kind of breath work that just gets you into the body, into the true self. So you can actually be with yourself and figure out where it is you need to go without following the dictator or the sloth, but following true self.
Yeah, we do that isn't really breathwork related, but a technique for parts polarizations is almost like imagining that they're both in the room with you and they're like sitting around a table and you're like sitting around a table with them and you've got to each ask each of them like why they're doing what they're doing. And then you almost have a mediator there, which is like your highest level self energy. And that self is like looking, trying to have a conversation with both of these parts so that they can understand why it is they're doing what you're doing. You can just, from what I'm hearing from you, is like, okay, you can get to that through the breath as well so that they're both getting serviced and regulated so that they don't have to be so extreme. I'm guessing that would be an outcome as well. Like the extremity isn't really there.
Yeah. And I love what that exercise is exactly kind of the work that I do with clients as well. But it's do the breath work first, get calm, and then ask the questions. And I guess if you're listening to this podcast and you're kind of aware of it and you've got a breathwork recording that you can pop on, you can do that. And then on the other side of the breathwork, say, okay, your equivalent of sloth, monster, and dictator, we all have them. Like we all have those just two separate parts, whatever you call them. How can we come together? And putting them at a table is a great idea of what to do.
Yeah. If you're a client of mine as well in the life and work transformation, I think I have Victoria's come and hosted a few of the groups. I think I have one of your breathwork recordings in the bonus section. So hop in there. Look for that if you're currently part of the cohort. I know that a lot listen. Do you want to just talk about like the difference? Because even you've kind of said to me, and it's so funny because I keep getting this ping like from different people being like, okay, I think the next step for you is like somatic. Like I've done so much shock therapy. I've done so much coaching. I've done so many different techniques that kind of like the next step for me is more like nervous system regulation. It's more like somatic experiencing with a somatic practitioner. But Could you just talk about, like, what you've seen in your life, like, the difference in your nervous system regulation with these techniques and how it's really
Absolutely.
helped you?
Yeah. So I would say maybe even just backing up a little bit. So I was at PwC for 10 years and I kind of had a revelation 7 years in that I didn't want to make partner anymore. And I was on secondment to Australia. I thought I'd go back to New York and make partner. That was always the plan. And during our first COVID lockdown here in Australia, I was like, wait, I'm looking at my partner 2 in the morning on the phone with him, on the phone with the CFO, thinking, I actually don't want to make partner. I don't want this anymore, but I didn't know what I wanted. So then I started my journey of neurolinguistic programming, holistic health coaching. I stayed at PwC for another 3 years as a high performer, but the most balanced that I'd ever been, the happiest I'd ever been in my career. And then the only reason I left was because I felt a stronger pull to do this instead. And then I really delved into my breathwork journey. So I had my first proper like breakthrough breathwork experience, which is a longer breathwork. And I cried and I opened up and I had all these beautiful visions of my brother. And I thought to myself, if this works for me, it can literally work for anyone. So that's when I went and studied breathwork. And that just 10x'd my process completely. So I had been doing, coaching. I had been doing my own IFS therapy with a practitioner therapist. I'd been doing, all this neurolinguistic programming, working, in all these different capacities on myself. But then when I added the breath work, it was just like, boom, like it just poured gas on the fire. And that's because I was really getting into my body. So what was happening was I was shedding layers of myself that I didn't need any longer, or maybe never needed, like armor. So it was like that first breath work where I cracked open that like hard exterior, intense layer of myself was gone. And it's like, okay, I'm feeling things and I'm more sensitive and I'm moving through all of these things. And I was able to kind of in the breath work practice see those things that I didn't need anymore and kind of see all those things and be able to be grateful for those experiences in my life, but then also move past them. And I think when we do breath work, we always say you kind of open yourself up, you take yourself apart. Same thing would be true for somatics. And a lot of times breath work and somatics really go hand in hand very nicely. Although I'm not a trained somatics therapist, I know people who have put those two together really beautifully. We say something leaves you and something comes in. And sometimes you know exactly what that something is. And sometimes you have no idea. And you can either choose to try and make meaning of it or you could just let it be. But you leave a breathwork session with whatever it is you need. Sometimes you leave feeling heavier. Sometimes you feel leaving lighter and you can kind of integrate and process those changes that you've had. But it just really blows out the cobwebs of what's in your body. So like you're, referencing, so with somatics, if you've got some kind of stored trauma, doesn't have to be big T trauma, it could be little tiny T trauma. You might not even know it's there. It's stored in your body. How can you release it? So with breathwork, we actually open up a loop to safely process unprocessed emotions or traumas or whatever you want to call them that have been stored in the body. And then when you process them, they're gone. So we try and talk so much about it. But if you just get into the body, you can kind of release it. And breathwork for me has been an amazing practice to do that.
So you spoke about armor. Can you talk about just what that means in day to day? Like, what did having armor look like? Because I think Brene Brown talks a lot about it, but I think there's so many of us that have this armor, but maybe won't recognize what it looks like.
Totally. I love that question. For me, it looked like just moving really fast all the time. I was like constantly on the go. I was either exercising a lot or working a lot. I was doing a lot for my friends. I was traveling. And actually it didn't show up in a dangerous or not so nice way. My armor was kind of like, yeah, I'm just like I'm like bulldozing through life. But I didn't really have that sensitivity that I have now. So I guess if I try and really think about this, like the analogy that I use when I work with high performers now, when they start to get into the process, so they've been working with me for 6 months, let's say, I'm like, now you're like the princess and the pea. So you know that fairy tale with the princess and she's sleeping on all these meshes and she's got a little pea under the bottom. And instead of going under and finding the pea and taking it out, she just keeps adding another mattress, but she's like very sensitive and she can feel the pea. So it's like now that you've created this kind of sensitivity in your life, you have to go in and find the pea, which is not as easy to find as a toxic relationship or, a toxic relationship with food or alcohol or work or something like that. So once that armor comes off, you become a little bit more sensitive and you can start to delve into those more, I don't want to say niche, but more hard to reach areas of your life because you're more sensitive and you can see them and feel them a little bit more. So I don't know if that's helpful for anyone else, but armor for me, that's what it was. I was just kind of like bulldozing through. Everything was fine, but nothing was great, if that makes sense, because I wasn't feeling
Yeah.
anything.
So what would those hard to reach areas be? Like,
Mm.
some
Like,
more examples of those.
yeah. So I think it's different for everyone. Like for me, it was, I had a toxic relationship with work and with food. And then and with my body and exercise and all of that stuff. And then when all of that fell away, I was like, well, I will just be perfectly happy and everything will be easy. But then you start to look at like the more minor things that only show up sometimes. So like anxious attachment style, for example, in a relationship starts to pop up. It's like, okay, well, now I have the capacity to deal with that. Or like negative self chatter in my head when before I give a presentation. Okay, now I can start to deal with that. So it's like these smaller, more nuanced things that start to happen, or like very slight patterns that you notice in friendships or relationships. And then you actually have the headspace or capacity to deal with them.
Yeah, for me, it's the Fun Day gummies. You know, have like
Here, you sponsored.
if you're in Australia, there are these like little Fun Day gummies. It was so funny that don't start eating them. But I was talking to like a really close childhood friend and about it yesterday, and she was like, "That's your vice, like one packet of these Fun Day gummies." And I was like, "Yes, I'm like fucking enlightened now. Like this is my main vice. I don't have anything else to work on."
That's such a good example. The same thing happens. A really easy, tangible example is like if you're someone who stops drinking. Like for me, drinking just fell out of my life because it was no longer aligned. And now when I drink, I'm like, doesn't feel good for me anymore because I'm more sensitive. Same thing with food. Like if you're someone who eats really clean and then you eat something really bad, you feel like crap. Like I personally, I couldn't imagine eating like fast food because I would feel hungover. But there are people
Yeah,
who eat fast food all the time, so for them it's normal. So it's a similar thing, but with high performers, it tends to be who usually have a pretty good exercise routine. They usually have a pretty good diet. They're usually taking care of themselves in a pretty good way. But it's the more subtle things that start to show up once you shed that armor, because then you can just go the next layer, the next layer, the next layer. Um, and once you work on the subtleties, and I know for some people that sounds intimidating or like, well, I don't want to be working on myself forever. And it's like, well, that you are the best project you're ever going to work on. So you might as well dive in and commit to the next 60 years of working on the project that is you and dealing with those little subtleties and, clearing sometimes I use the analogy of like picking up sand with the chopsticks. And it's like hard to pick it up. But once you pick it up, it's so satisfying. You're like, oh, I've realized that pattern. Now it's gone because I cleared it because I had the headspace.
and first, what I see is at first it is big. Like some people come to me and they do have these glaring patterns. They do have a really toxic relationship, or they are workaholics, or they're never actually working out. They don't take care of themselves. And then it becomes more and more subtle where even in myself, like I used to have, you know, very just like everything was very dysfunctional. And now it's like
Mhm.
my dysfunction is like a packet of Fun Day gummies, 3 times a week. But even that, because I know ultimately it's not good for my inflammation. I know it's like I don't really do well when I'm in any type. Once I introduce one type of sugar, then that comes to another type of sugar. Then for me, it's like then I start ruminating on it, thinking like, the things do become subtler, but they can also like the little pea cannot still have such a big impact.
Yeah,
So
it's objective. Yeah,
yeah,
it's objective.
yeah, yeah,
And that's interesting what you say too about people you work with. And I think the most common thing I see is people who are just addicted to external validation from work, and they find it easier to get external validation from work rather than take the time or create the space to get the external validation from the things that they really want in their life, which is like a loving relationship or, a lot of times it's a loving relationship or a really good fitness routine. So that's a really interesting one to unpack too, is like, why do people get so addicted to that structure of chasing the promotion or the next thing that's right there in front of them, even though they know that there's something else that they really want in their life that's way more important to them? Like, how do you actually notice that you're in that pattern?
Yeah. One of my groups, we just finished a module on values and a module on purpose. And I actually just wrote a post on this today because someone in my group, shout out Monica if you're listening to this, but she asked the question of why is it that we have these things that we really want to do that are in line with our purpose and our values, but we don't really spend time doing them. And I really thought about that because it was like that's such an interesting question of we really know what is for our highest good. Like, everyone knows. Everyone knows that, like, for me, like, I know that the packet of Fun Day gummies isn't, like, my highest self or, like, and that is such a minute answer, but those examples used to be, like, pretty catastrophic earlier on before I got sober and, all this other stuff. I think that the answer, from what I could see in my work and the trends of working with people, is that I really see, like, 3 different answers. Like, one is tribal shaming. So the theory that using shame and using, almost withholding love and withholding affection as a way for people to be accepted and stay within the tribe. So an example of this is, like, I come from a family of lawyers, right? I'm not gonna be a fucking lawyer, like, there's just no way. But I wanted to get my creative writing degree, and it was just like, no, you're gonna go work at corporate. You're not gonna go get a creative writing degree. 10 years later, I actually got that creative writing degree on my own. But it was like kind of a subtle, and not saying that my family really did this, like they're extremely supportive of what I do now. But sometimes there are these sacrifices that we make to be loved and accepted by people around us. So like an interesting thing is like, okay, being on the partner track at PwC, it's like everyone around me or everyone is like gearing toward that path. Like, I want to still be loved and accepted. So I'm going to sacrifice, everything else. So I think that's kind of like the first part. But then the second thing is like, if you've got really intense comparison parts, so you've got parts that constantly think that you're never good enough, constantly want to get validation, then those parts are always going to reach for achievement and validation first, which means like things that give you wealth, power, status, because those are what society recognizes as important. That part will always reach for those things over creativity, nourishment, because like again, it's this like real drive of like, this is going to get me to be accepted versus like, this is going to get me to be like self-accepted. And that's what makes both of our programs really special, is because you're like with people who want to live in their purpose and want to live by their values. And it's a unique, especially with high performers that are in corporate, like it's not based on achievement, what we do.
Yeah.
And that can be so foreign to people where it's like, no, this is just based on what is like highest for you and how do you achieve that, not like what looks good. That's not, you can't be good at my program. Like I don't think you can be good at your program. It's just not possible. It's not built like that.
Yeah. Well, and I love that. That's the exact concept, is working with high performers is different than working with non-high performers. Like, high performers, they don't want to change what they're doing because what they're doing has gotten them to where they are and their life is pretty good. But they know that they're not living in their highest purpose. They know that there are things that they can change. But it looks pretty scary to make a change when it feels like you have so much to lose. But what I always encourage high performers in my programs is to think about, if you're here and you could, that means you could get here. We hear so many stories about people who, hit rock bottom and they turn their life around and changed everything. And now they're living this amazing dream. But I kind of have a theory that not all high performers, but most high performers don't actually hit rock bottom. They hit something that's like pretty hard, but they can sustain it still. And then they sustain that level, steady, not bad, but not great lifestyle for 30 years, making $1 million, driving a Range Rover Sport, everything is good, but they're not really fully happy because they're not living their purpose. But because they're so high performing, they're never going to hit that real rock bottom that then encourages them to have their shift. So that's why for high performers, it's that like subtle scratch inside that's like, hey, I should be exploring myself more. I should do something differently. I should find out, what is my actual internal, validation code. Like something I wrote a post on last week, which is external validation looks good on you, but be careful. It might get you in trouble with your true self, which is exactly what you were just saying. It's like you chase all these kind of, someone in my program said, feels like I'm collecting Mario Kart tokens, and those tokens don't mean anything to me anymore. So now I have to redefine what tokens I actually want to create in my life. And I think that that sometimes can be scary for people, especially for a high performer that's like, well, all this like has been pretty good so far. So how do you change that? And I think that's kind of the structured way of what the work that we're doing is change it slowly, change it with nervous system regulation, change it with these steps to actually figure out where it is that you're headed. So yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and, I kind of, like, disagree a little bit with what you're saying, like, I've
Mhm.
had a lot of clients reach pretty severe rock bottoms, like, cancer diagnoses, family
Right.
falling apart, like, health so I think that I mean, it could
But
look
my question is like, why does it have to get to that point? Like, I would love to know those clients if they had the quiet scratching 5 years ago. That was like, hey, let's look at this, and then you just keep going and going and going and going, and then eventually you do hit that rock bottom. It just takes a lot longer because they keep pushing, 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 and then that chronic illness shows up or something happens. But it's like so many high performers we see today, they're just going to go for a while and then eventually have a dip down. But it's like, why do you have to wait till rock bottom? Why do you have to push so hard? You know? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't ever wanna I never want to imply that, like, especially with something like cancer, like, this is something that people bring on to themselves, like, I don't wanna,
Right.
like, say it like that, but it's
Of course. Of
I think
course.
that there's, if you look at like couples therapy for an example, when couples therapy is really effective is when it's like preventative, when there first starts to
Like,
be an issue. Couples therapy is not effective when this is the last step before divorce. And like you're like, this is our last ditch effort. But so many people, and I could see like, I bet couples therapists are so fucking frustrated because I feel like they would be like, if only you would come to me 3 years before when we could actually, like, work through something, when there was still a lot of, like, love and happiness and tenderness in the
yeah.
relationship, and it's the same thing for I think for life coaching of, like, you don't have to hit a rock bottom, like, in AA, which is, like, these things are, like, they're bound to happen, maybe they haven't happened yet. You can be, like, a high bottom drunk, like, I was, like, a high bottom alcoholic where, like, everything was falling apart, but, like, I still worked at LinkedIn. I still was making, like, 250K, like, in active alcoholism, like, I still, like, had
Mhm.
friends and partied, I didn't have any health issues, I still had relationships, like, it wasn't I wasn't sitting there, like, homeless, jobless, hospitalized, like, I was just like, "No, there's a problem, and it's likely gonna get worse." I think we have clients in different stages of the journey because sometimes do clients do come to me when, like, I have, like, different types of spectrums, but there are clients that come to me when things are really bad, where they're just like, "I can't go on like this anymore." Like, it's definitely not sustainable. I'm kind of breaking down, and this is why I'm coming to you versus, like and of course, there are clients that are like, "Things are still good, but they could be better." Probably has to do with our marketing too, like,
Probably, yeah, because I'm a huge just like,
yeah, I'm a big pain marketer.
yeah, yeah. Mine's like, your life is great. Everything on paper is perfect, but there's something missing. Let's find out what it is. And I'm not saying that no, these things like high performers don't hit rock bottom, but I think and maybe that's also just the cohorts that I'm seeing is, I look at PwC or an equivalent, for example, people they have these amazing careers and their lives are like great. But there's oftentimes you talk to them and there's, like, something they wish they had done or something they wish they had explored, and it's like, well, what's stopping you? And maybe that's something that probably we can unpack at a later date.
Yeah, yeah,
Mm.
yeah,
But I think it's
which
the
is
tribal shaming you mentioned is true too. Because when I left PwC, when I first stepped off that treadmill, I was like, "Oh my god, they're all still moving and I'm not moving, and where am I? Is this the right thing?" And it was, I understood then more than ever in my life why people stay corporate forever. Um, there's nothing wrong with that. And most people that I work with, I'm like, stay in your corporate role. Just make sure that your corporate role is working for you and you're not, working for it. How can you structure it that way? But it was that moment where I was like, oh,
I didn't work for a year in burnout recovery, and I remember I ran into someone on the street, and she was at LinkedIn, and she was, like, about to go off to Europe or something, and she just made a comment, and she was like, "Oh, well, you don't work, right?" And I just remember the shame that I felt, like, and I was like the work that I was doing was, like, burnout recovery, PTSD recovery. I remember talking to my therapist about that, like, I had so much shame and resentment for that comment because it was, like, my whole identity was around work, and it was like, "Oh, I'm not one of you anymore." And
Right.
and that can be so strong as well, and that's why people stay in these destructive things, like whether that be destructive relationships or destructive careers, like that are destructive to their soul, because the sense of belonging and needing to belong is so, I mean, it's so primitive in us, but it can have like if you're trying to belong to the wrong groups that aren't nourishing you and that don't necessarily want what's best for you. And sometimes that is your family. Like sometimes your family is not going to be the group that supports you in your highest self and in your highest good. And not, that's their trauma, that's their bullshit, whatever. But that is very hard for people to walk away from, or even for people to put boundaries in. And that's probably like one of the hardest tribes to distance yourself from. We're hardwired to go back to family.
No, I think it's such an interesting thing. And that comment that, yeah, I can remember. I was like, oh, I work for myself now. And I was like, the first time I said it, I was like, oh, our manager at PwC, like for ages. It's so funny how that starts to all fall away the further away you get from it. But yeah, it's interesting to remember what it was like to be in it. Yeah.
Well, Victoria, I feel like I could talk to you forever, but
I think we need a
where
part
can
two.
people? I know you need a part two on this. Probably just about tribal shaming. But where can people find you? Where can they find your programs if they're interested in doing breath work? Give me all the details.
Yeah. So thebalancedcorporate.com is my website. And then my Instagram is at thebalancedcorporate. So all my information is there. I've got a few more events coming up in Bondi before I head overseas for a bit. So if anyone is around the Sydney area, wants to come try breath work with me, I'd love to have you. And then, yeah, my next program kicks off in July. So all my information is there.
Great. Perfect. And we'll put all those links in the show notes. Well, thank you so much, Victoria, for this riveting conversation. I'm so happy that you're here today. And yeah, and I'll see you later. All right.
Sounds good.
Bye.
Bye.